welcome back to Between Parks Place and Capitol Hill, the Six News program all about law and government in Australia. We've got a great episode for you guys today, talking all about the Irish referendum from last month, I believe, on the 8th of March. I'm your host, Stuart Jeffrey, and joining me is our international correspondent, Elijah Granite, who we usually have talking about US stuff, but for once it's not US stuff, so you truly are international this time.
Yes, truly doing my best to know very little about a lot of different countries. We're here today to talk about the Irish constitutional referendums on the 8th of March. On a 44% turnout, the electors rejected two constitutional amendments by a wide margin, one on revising the definition of the family by 67% against, and one on replacing provisions on the role of women and mothers in the home with a provision on care, with 74% against. Here to discuss the background of these referendums and the constitutional law and politics of Ireland is Dr. Conor Casey. Conor is an Associate Professor of Public Law and Legal Theory at the University of Surrey in the UK, specializing in constitutional theory. He has been cited by, among others, the Irish Supreme Court, the House of Lords Constitution Committee, the English Attorney General, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, and now, best of all, Six News. Welcome, Conor.
Thanks very much, Elijah and Stuart. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's get started with the very basics. The Constitution of Ireland is a parliamentary democracy, something that is going to be familiar to our viewers in Australia, but what is the framework of it? How is it different? How is it similar to the sort of Westminster constitutional model that I think our viewers will know from the UK, Australia, Canada, and sort of other countries?
Yeah, the nuts and bolts parts of the Constitution, the structural features, are in many ways a classic Westminster model. So government is centered around a Taoiseach, that's a prime minister, leading a cabinet which can command the confidence of the lower house, which is the Dáil. Our parliament's made up of three elements: lower house, directly elected, the Dáil; upper house, a hybrid between appointments and the special kind of election, the Seanad, much weaker than the lower house; and then the president, who largely is a ceremonial function. So effective executive power and effective legislative power belong with the sort of fused executive legislative branch in the lower house. So the government, as long as it can command confidence with the majority or plurality, has quite a concentrated form of power. Now, where Ireland differs from the UK system would be particularly its provision for judicial review of legislation. Irish ordinary courts are vested with, from the High Court, Court of Appeal, and Supreme Court, with the power to invalidate legislation that is repugnant to the Constitution. So that is a big change. And two other features are that the Constitution can only be amended by a referendum, which involves a bill to amend the Constitution being passed by both houses and then being approved by a majority of voters on the day. So it can't be changed by ordinary legislation. And then the president, largely ceremonial function. So the president, it's in the president's name that all appointments and dismissals of judges and ministers, etc., are made, but that's on the advice and consent of the Taoiseach that can command the confidence of the House. The president has at least one very important substantive power at his absolute discretion, her absolute discretion, which is, before a bill is signed into law, if the president has a concern about its constitutionality, the president can refer that bill to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will consider it in the abstract, which is sort of the closest Irish courts come to serving as a classic constitutional court. They'll consider the bill in the abstract, and if they find it unconstitutional, they won't sign it into law. So that is a substantive power the president has. So you can see that the core of governing is similar to the Westminster model, but there are a lot of sort of conspicuous novelties added on that really separate the Irish constitutional system.
And on the topic of those conspicuous novelties, I think one of the things that stands out about the Irish Constitution is, beyond just the mechanics of the institutions, there's a lot of values and statements of principles. Can you give us an idea of kind of where these values and ideas come from and how they come into the Constitution. Of course, that's end up what these referendums were ultimately about.
Yeah, the Irish Constitution was enacted in 1937. It was masterminded by then Taoiseach Eamon de Valera, along with a superbly elite and cosmopolitan team of drafters that are increasingly getting their historical recognition. It's sometimes falsely attributed to de Valera alone, but people like John Hearn, who's sometimes called the architect in chief, had a big influence. And the influences, intellectual influences on the Constitution are actually quite varied. So some provisions, the ones providing for right to fair trial and habeas corpus, they are classic sort of common law guarantees. Others, and this is probably more well known, fundamental rights provisions in the Constitution, especially those concerning the family, parental rights over the education rearing of their children, and religious liberty, are steeped in the classical natural law tradition, the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, as filtered through Catholic social teaching. So there is strong evidence that quite a lot of the fundamental rights provisions were influenced by papal encyclicals. But the precise wording of some of the provisions was drawn from continental constitutions that were in being in the post-war period, like the Portuguese constitution, the Czechoslovakian, the Austrian, and even the Irish president was structured around the Weimar Constitution of 1919. So that was a big influence on a lot of the rights provisions as well. So yeah, you have a melange of influences, I would say. But yes, when it comes to the fundamental rights provisions, I would say that natural law, Catholic social teaching would predominate.
And then, as you say, it was this elitist document, but of course, it had its test. It was approved by the people, and it has been amended by the people. So I'm curious how over time, how much has that original scheme of values stayed? How much has it changed? And kind of when you have this elitist document, which is ultimately controlled and changed by the will of the people, how has that evolved in those years since 1937?
Yeah. So when I said an elite team, I meant that in a very complimentary sense. I think the document draft is superb. So it was drafted by a small team, as you say, it was approved, and it was a point of pride for De Valera that, unlike the constitution that preceded it, which was the Constitution of the Irish Free State, that could be amended by ordinary legislation, and the governments had used that sort of loophole to shred the document. By that stage, most of the fundamental rights provisions and such were destroyed by the insertion of a really draconian Article 2A, which basically gave the government power by decree to suspend all fundamental rights and govern through military tribunals. And so he thought that made a mockery of the idea of a constitution. So it was a point of pride to him that you could only change this basic law through the popular referendum process. He said if there's one fact that's made clear by the constitution, it's that the people are masters. So that was sort of always his intention. And the greatest sort of maybe test of that commitment is the fact, as you sort of allude to, that the Irish Constitution has in recent years been amended in such a way that has rejected or changed the fundamental sort of natural law Catholic social teaching provisions. So in recent years, there's been a removal on the ban of divorce, deletion of blasphemy, this provision for same-sex marriage, a repeal of a pro-life amendment, which was inserted in 1983. So the Constitution now is even more sort of, I said there was a melange of influences going into the Constitution. Well, it's even more so now because you do have you have your old common law influence provisions. You still have your natural law influence provisions in family and education, especially. And then now you have a more sort of socially liberal sort of spate of amendments. So these all exist together. And it's the Constitution still works. There's no, as far as I can tell, there's absolutely zero appetite for a full scale revision or a constituent assembly. So I think that even though from the outside the document might look internally incoherent because of all these different influences, there's still a strong sense of popular, I think, affinity for the Constitution. Probably because there is a sense of ownership over it. It can be updated, it can be changed in whatever way a majority of the people want it to go.
Now, when you do referendums, I know you guys don't really have any states. The way we do is double majority, the majority of people in the majority of states, and the majority of states overall. Can you just walk me through the process and how you amend the Irish Constitution and how that kind of differs in its process?
Of course, it's quite straightforward in the Irish system. If a bill to amend the Constitution is introduced into the Parliament, into the lower house, has to get approved by the lower house, the Dáil, upper house, the Seanad, and then it goes to a popular referendum, and it's just a majority of people voting on the day. So there's no threshold requirement. It doesn't need to be a majority of people on the electoral register. It's just a majority of people who show up and cast a ballot on the day. If there's a bare majority, it passes. If there's not, it doesn't. So it is you still have to get enough popular buy-in in the legislature, and you need to get a majority. But compared to the Australian model, for example, or the United States, it's comparatively easy enough to do. It's not the most cumbersome process.
Now, looking at this one in particular, I believe there's four stances that were taken or four big ones that were taken on the amendment. How does that actually operate? Because I know usually we think of it's yes or no, but I believe here that there were more than just two perspectives on the referendum. So before we get into the actual details of it, why do you have so many varieties? So is it more than a yes or a no, or how does that operate in this context when you have more than two stances?
Well, the proposal puts the mechanism for choosing is yes or no. I think that when it comes to these two referendums, as I think you're alluding to, the people's reasons for voting yes or no, mostly no, varied quite a lot, but the choice is binary. Do you approve or do you disapprove? Or do you spoil your ballot? Those are the only options when you're in the booth.
At least in the Australian context, we recently had our voice referendum where we had a similar campaign, and you had the progressive no vote and the conservative no vote, who ended up both succeeding while having very different stances. But I guess what I'm getting at there with the Irish context is obviously there was a lot of support for the referendum beforehand. So I wanted to look at a bit of how exactly did this go out? Like not blow by blow, of course, but why did this referendum, which we thought had so much chance of success, why did that ultimately end up being? I don't want to call it a flop, but it was roughly 2/3 vote against it, which is what we had The Voice in Australia, of course. So the media hype around it, I guess, how was it approached by the media, of course, in the lead up to it, and then of course the aftermath as well of the referendum?
Yeah, it's a very rich and fascinating story. I'll kind of give it an abridged version, and I'll take each amendment in turn because there's two we're dealing with. So one of the amendments proposed to, at the minute, the Irish Constitution, it says it recognizes the family as, quote, the natural, primary, and fundamental unit group of society, as a moral institution possessing inalienable and imprescriptible rights, antecedent and superior to all positive law. And then it goes on to say that the state pledges to guard the institution of marriage on which the family is founded. So the Irish Constitution, its understanding of the family unit is one based on marriage. And after the same-sex marriage referendum, that includes same-sex couples as well. So whether you're same-sex married or a heterosexual marriage, that is seen as the fundamental unit group of society. So that doesn't include other forms of family unit not based on marriage. And The proposed amendment was designed to sort of rectify that. So the amended text, if it succeeded, would have said the state recognizes the family, whether founded on marriage or on other durable relationships, to have such and such a right. So that was the proposal. The reason this one flopped, and I think it was a massive flop, was for several reasons. One reason I don't think it failed is I don't think it was a sort of sign of a revival of genuine social conservatism in Ireland. I don't think most people were rejecting it because they affirmatively do believe that marriage is the fundamental, the married family is the fundamental unit and should remain so, and it should be the ideal to which people aspire to. I don't think it was that. I think it was the sort of sense that the other durable relationships was fatally or cripplingly ambiguous. I think that was the concern. What kind of relationships would it cover and give these sort of suite of rights to? Would it have destabilizing impact or uncertain impact in spheres like immigration or succession or imposing obligations on people who might not think they have obligations? So people are cohabiting and they don't want to get married. Suddenly, if they break up, maybe they have financial obligations to each other they didn't have before. So there was ambiguity, and it wasn't helped by the fact that with the parties that were campaigning for it, you'd hear contradictory things. So on one interview, a minister said, well, of course, this will have, big impact on immigration and family reunification applications, because if you have constitutional rights to family as someone who's not married, then maybe it's easier for you to bring family over from a third country. Then they wrote back on that and said, well, actually, no, we don't think it will have this impact. We have to wait until the courts determine. The courts will determine on a case-by-case basis whether such and such a unit is a family. And people didn't like that because they said, with due respect to the courts, they thought I would like some clarity now on what I'm voting on. And the reply from a lot of constitutional academics was, well, that's often not the way constitutional interpretation works. You put broad aspirational wording in, and then you have to trust the courts. And that didn't sit well with a lot of people. So I'd say that is the main reason that one failed. I think most Irish people probably would wish for a more liberalizing provision than the current one. So I don't think it's a sort of, a revival of conservative thinking. I think it was the ambiguity of that particular provision. And you also can't underestimate that a lot of people just wanted to probably give the government a bloody nose because this government's been in power for quite a long time and is very unpopular. I think it's fair to say it's on its last legs before a general election. So never underestimate that factor as well. But I think mostly it was the fatal ambiguity combined with contradictory statements coming out. The other amendment was the care amendment. This was designed to sort of replace a provision in the Constitution which says, it's often sort of misquoted, but the provision says that the state recognizes that by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. The states shall therefore endeavour to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour to the neglect of their duties in the home. So the provision sometimes misquoted is, women should stay in the home and the state should make it so they should stay in the home or something like that. It's more, at its time, it was drafted. Ireland was a primarily rural agrarian society, and the labour most men would have done out of the home would have been quite hard manual labour. And there was a problem of children and women engaging in out of economic necessity labor that was quite painful and difficult to do. So it was a sort of recognition that it was a value of care in the home, and it was sort of it was a statement that out of economic necessity, people shouldn't be sort of pushed into labor that is unsuited to their physicality or what have you. So that was the context of the time. The proposal would have replaced that with gender neutral recognition of the value of care in the home. So it would have said The state recognises that the provision of care by members of a family to one another, by reason of the bonds that exist among them, gives this to society support which is the common good, cannot be achieved without something along those lines. This one is very interesting for the coalition that it built between more conservative-minded people and more left-leaning people. So the left-leaning people disliked this provision because they felt it was a watered-down version of what had been originally proposed by the Citizens' Assembly, which we can maybe talk about in a moment. The Citizens' Assembly proposed wording that would have seemed to have placed a binding legal obligation on the state to support carers with to take material steps to support carers that could be reviewed by a court. This language was designed, people think, and I think correctly, in light of legal advice that has been designed to be pious padding, really. So people who were left-leaning people thought it was a symbolic gesture politics, and they wanted a stronger legal obligation on the state to help support care. So they didn't mind as much what was driving the more social conservative side, who many did want a sort of more beefed up level of sort of obligation on the state, but they also objected to the removal of the one reference to mothers in the Constitution. They didn't want that provision removed. They said they liked the reference to the work that mothers do, and for a lot of people, they who maybe aren't very politically minded, I think they would have been annoyed. They would have heard different things from different commentators. So they would have heard the minister proposing the amendment saying, "Oh, this will change things. This will put obligations on the government." But then they'll be hearing from most other legal commentators saying this actually won't, and they would again be annoyed at the ambiguity and maybe a feeling that they're being sold a lemon. They're being promised the amendment will do one thing, but the government knows well it won't play out that way. And so I think that would have annoyed a lot of voters. So that amendment, when it flopped, it was because of quite an interesting coalition.
Now, I believe Ireland was one of the first countries in the West, if not the first country, to legalize same-sex marriage. But now you also have this vote handily being defeated. So what do you think the future of these social, moral, and values provisions in the Constitution, what do you think the future is for those from the next, say, 10 years or so?
I don't think they'll be... I don't think the family provision will be touched because it is a difficult one to amend. And I think the government realized that if you're not going to be specific about what family arrangements you're going to protect, then you have to go ambiguous and open-ended. And that was the source of concern. So I don't think that one will be salvaged. I think family provision will stay as is. But the government can provide, if it wants to provide enhanced protections for people who are cohabiting or in different forms of durable relationships, it can do that by legislation. So if it really, really, really wants to provide materially benefit people in those situations or try and bring them nearly up to par with protections for married families, they can do that. On care amendment, you might see if Sinn Féin, who are the largest party, but not in government, if they get into government, they said they would rerun that amendment and put in stronger obligations in the state. That might be rerun, but that's always a risky thing to do, to go back to the people, and people might get annoyed at that and say we've already spoken on this issue, don't want it again. So I am not sure if either of them were to be rerun, it would be the care amendment, but this time with sort of a more onerous burden placed on the state to actually take active steps. But I think it's unlikely. I can't imagine the government run that again. So I think both provisions are secure for now, and until I don't think we'll see fundamental changes to the fundamental rights provisions unless and until maybe the question of Irish unification is on the table and whether we have to draft a new constitution for an all island political entity.
If you had said that last, but I was going to say, or an excellent end on is it depends, like a true lawyer. But I think with that as well, like they've a lack of change, I guess that does hold up between. Was there any major referendums you've had between same-sex marriage and this one for any of these provisions?
So between okay, so in the last couple of years, the big ones we've had. There was a pretty big one. People wanted to. The government had a proposal to abolish the Senate, the Seanad, and the Seanad's an interesting one because it's a weak house, and people have like Eamon de Valera didn't want a Seanad. He hated the idea of a Seanad. He didn't like an upper house frustrating what he was doing. So he eventually conceded and created one that was very weak. And people have been talking about reforming the Seanad for years, but like the House of Lords, people don't know what to do with it. So there's a proposal to abolish it in 2013, and that was rejected. And nothing has been done to change the Seanad, but that would have been a big change. In terms of value-based amendments, there was a removal of the Constitution requires blasphemy to be criminalised, but it never was, so people just ignored that provision. But that has been repealed, so that is a sort of symbolic type provision. Divorce it was a constitutional amendment in the 1990s which legalized divorce, but more recently there was an amendment that reduced the waiting time for when you had to sort of be separated to get divorced, I think from 5 years to 2. So those are sort of value-based amendments. The trend has been sort of liberalizing type amendments, secularizing, liberalizing amendments. So, and I don't, as I said, I don't think the family unit amendment rejection is a sort of, revival of social conservative Catholic social thinking on these issues. I don't think that was the case. I think that, if there was a way to draft it that wasn't so ambiguous, people would probably support it. So I'm trying to think. There's no other sort of big symbolic liberalizing amendments on the table at the minute, but you can imagine some provisions people would like to get rid of if they thought they could do it, like the preamble. The preamble of the Constitution is strikingly Christian Catholic. One that opens with I have my pocket Constitution here. The preamble opens with the declaration, "In the name of the most holy Trinity, from whom is all authority, and to whom is our final end, all actions, both of men and states, must be referred. We, the people of Era." Da 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 da. I mean, some people would like to get rid of that, but that's not on the table at the minute. But yeah, the trend of the last sort of several referendums has been sort of liberalizing, secularizing. And as I mentioned to Elijah earlier, it does mean the Constitution is internally incoherent in terms of the values it espouses. On the one hand, but natural law, Catholic social teachings sitting alongside a provision which allows the Oireachtas to provide for the termination of pregnancies. You have these sort of sitting in the same provisions, but it is being a stable core of political life for over 80 years, and I as I said, there's no appetite for an entirely new constitution at the moment.
I think people don't understand just how the conservatives, that the Catholics, including Irish Catholics, aren't as right wing as their Protestant counterparts in the UK. Of course, early Australian Labor Party was very much Irish Catholic. It didn't have a Catholic PM until the mid 1930s. But I think that's probably an excellent spot to wrap up on just there, and with the possibility of seeing more in the future. So watch this space, it is, for any future referendums. Thank you very much for joining us, Connor.
My pleasure, sure. Thank you very much, Elijah.